Hey guys, so we just had a weekend of regional level events post new ban lists, and so I thought I'd take the time to do a rogue tier list by the data video as always, basically using Dueling Book data as well as some regional level topping information. And so you can always check my older videos out in terms of learning how the tier score is actually calculated. And before we continue, I actually want to highlight a few people who really spend a lot of time keeping up to date in terms of all the topping level information for regional level events, YCS level events, and making these spreadsheets publicly available. So definitely go check out TSPYGO, LampyYGO, as well as Ivan. I'll link down their Twitter below, and you can check out their other socials through that way. And so of course, a big shout out to my sponsors as usual, links and discount codes in the description below, and a particular shout out to Dragon Shield because they now actually have custom sleeve available for Yu-Gi-Oh size sleeves. Previously they only had it for standard size, but now you can get custom art for your Yu-Gi-Oh sleeves. And so I personally just had one for my channel, and certainly you can feel free to put whatever image that you want, and you can certainly use my affiliate link down below. And yes, that is the Starlight that I pulled in my regional entry packs just a few days ago, which is really insane. And so now to actually get on with the video, in terms of YGO scope where I use it for Dueling Book data, there's of course some decks that are not actually properly identified, at least not yet. And that includes something like Vanquish Soul, for example, as well as Mannadium. Now, in my previous meta tier list by the data video that I did a week ago, I unfortunately did not look at Vanquish Soul separately. I really should have. I actually overlooked that, and I should have at least tried to do a proxy measure for that deck. And I kind of quickly did it. It ended up being scored as tier 1 actually. So basically, it won't be part of this video anyways, because we're looking at just rogue decks. But we will still look at something like Mannadium as well as Superheavy Samurai. And so starting the rogue tier list for June, we are going to start with Mathmech, which technically I wasn't really sure to put it at rogue yet. I mean, it could be argued for tier 2, like maybe at the edge of it. But you know what, with that circular ban, it's kind of a big hit. I'm sure they'll hang on there, and maybe, there's going to be like more cyber support moving forward in the future. So this deck will probably be at least pretty good as long as the bestials are not too prevalent. And so you know what, it actually still had some regional tops so far in just one weekend alone. And I'm sure we'll see a bit more of that, but sadly probably not at the same level that we saw just before this ban list. And then we have Fluandries, which actually had some pretty high hopes going into this new format post-ban list. I mean, it's a deck that can utilize Shifter really well, and so I guess that usually helps you stay in the game for the most part. Most decks need the graveyard, of course, aside from Kashtira. And so you know what, I think despite the lack of Barrier Statue, Dreaming Town, M-Pen, Mist Valley, Apex Avian can still hold some things on its own, I suppose, and so it's still hanging in there. 60% match win percentage on Dueling Book, usually around that range for this deck somehow, which is very high. And not to mention, it actually had a pretty good amount of regional tops, at least among rogue decks. So next we have Punk, which I guess is more so gold price Punk. I think that's the more competitive viable strategy, at least at regional level success. That's the ones that's getting some regional tops, and it actually did post ban list as well, and it did have at least a little bit last format as well. So it's been hanging in there for last little while. It's a very synchro based strategy. You lose a lot of life points though, but that in turn synergizes with like the gold price stuff. And now, while it used to be a pretty expensive deck for a rogue deck, because of the reprints coming in Battles of Legend in like the next week or two, this deck I assume will be a lot more affordable, at least for those of you who really love that synchro strategy. So next we have Rika, which of course is one of the decks that cannot be properly identified through YGO scope. I have to sort of do a proxy measure based on some of the Rika cards that are played in the deck. And anyways, regional level success has shown that it can do well last format as well as now into this new format, first week into the ban list. And so 59% win percentage among all players is also very impressive. Usually that sort of level is seen almost in like the tier 1 decks, and of course, when piloted by the right player, Rika can do really well. It has a really interesting kind of gimmick, being able to like tribute off your opponent's monsters to be able to do their things, which very often is kind of hard to respond to. It's sort of like how Infernoids worked back in the day, but now this is the more competitively viable version, and it's got a pretty heavy combo aspect to it as well. So really fun deck if you're into that. So next we have Mannadium Scareclaw, and the reason I had to combine them is because it's another one of those decks that cannot be properly identified through YGO scope yet. And as I look through the Mannadium cards, technically this deck also happens to play some Scareclaw cards as well, so I can't actually distinguish between the two decks, so I just decided to combine them. But you know what, 58% win percentage among all decks. Again, this is very high, especially for a rogue deck, and it's I think starting to show competitive success. If you watch my top 4 Toronto regional deck profile, basically Max, he finished top 4 at Toronto regionals with this deck, which is really cool, and a big congrats to him again. So definitely go check that out if you want to learn what the deck lists are typically like, but this is definitely a deck to watch out for. And then we have what's called kind of like red eyes. You kind of tend to see this on Dueling Book. It's kind of funny, and especially because I guess now Dragoon is, it's good again, right? I mean, Kashtira, at least heading into this format, you had decks like Kashtira and Labyrinth being considered as, tier 1 decks. Is it still, at least for Kashtira? Definitely. Labyrinth, I think it's up for discussion, especially now that we have a surprise factor in Vanquish Soul starting to do really well at regional level events. But you know what, Dragoon, whatever deck is 62%. These are really, really high win percentages, and I guess especially on Dueling Book, if you kind of play with like Floodgates and Dragoon, it's kind of hard to out a lot of times, and people probably just quit and go move on to the next match. So you know what, but it's still there, at least online, respectable. In terms of IRL play, you pretty much almost never see a deck like this top. Then we have Dinos, which of course with some of the new cards from Wild Survivors, perhaps it beefed it up. Did it beef it up enough to do better at regional levels? I'm not too sure. I mean, win percentage wise, 47%. It's kind of low. For a rogue deck, you at least want to ideally be around that 50% range, at least from the times that I've been doing these analysis. But you know what? It's still a fan favorite deck, and it's typically a going second, like break your board and like kind of strategy, but sometimes it can be going first as well, especially like scrap dinos, for example. So you can really go both ways. So I think it's still a really, really cool strategy, and definitely a budget one that you can try out. And then we have Traptrix. Speaking of budget, really the most budget deck there is. So you know what, in terms of play online, it's definitely fallen down a lot since the structure deck release hype, but it's still pretty solid. Win percentage 47%, that is again pretty low. Hey, at least it had one regional top so far, and probably will get more in the future. And so of course, a lot of new players I think tend to start up with this deck. At least that's certainly how I would recommend it. So that might kind of bring down the win percentage down. It's a very good entry deck. So definitely something to consider. But you know what, going second is a little challenging with this deck from what I heard, but going first, you know what, the deck is still pretty formidable. It has the combination of trap and monster interruptions, which is always nice to have that kind of balance, and has a lot of cool interactions as well. So next we have Heroes, which of course is somehow always one of the more played decks online in general, not just among rogue decks, but just all decks overall. So I guess that's maybe not too surprising. It is a fan favorite deck, and it just keeps getting support, and actually speaking of support, they're actually getting more in Battles of Legend coming on the next week or two. So really, really cool. Sometimes I wish I was a hero player just so I can enjoy all this new support that comes along with it, but hopefully my pet deck and Cyber Dragons will get some direct support hopefully soon. But you know what, duality in Battles of Legend is kind of a start, at least in terms of indirect support. Next we have Dark World, which I'm kind of surprised that it's actually still seeing this amount of play. I think while Droll may not be played as much as that brief format we had when Super Heavy Samurai and Pearly were like one of the better decks, where Droll was going to be main deck for sure, and now Droll is probably not main deck, but it's probably at least still seeing some pretty good amount of side deck play, especially when you have something like Runic Sprite, which draws a lot, or any Runic variant, and Droll is still kind of necessary, and Dark World kind of folds to Droll for the most part. But you know what, 49% match win percentage, pretty good. But again, especially online on Dueling Book, this is one of those decks a lot of players might not really want to bother sitting through it, because it's just essentially you're just comboing for like 20 minutes, and then do you win or do you lose? There's not much interaction for the most part, but nonetheless, it actually had a regional top so far, and perhaps there will be more. So next we have Marinces, which actually already has a regional top so far into this first weekend of new ban list, and I'm sure there will be more to come, because this deck has definitely shown that it's getting regional level event as well as YCS level events, even in terms of tops. So definitely a rogue deck to watch out for. 57% win percentage among all players, also quite high, and you know what, saw a decent amount of play among all rogue decks in general, and so definitely something to watch out for. Kind of a combo deck essentially, but you know what, in terms of its end board, it's usually not too crazy, at least in terms of board presence, but it's kind of deceptive too, because it's a deck that can play a lot of hand traps. It also has that trap you can play from hand, which is like really good, by the way. It like negates your monster and then they become unaffected. So very sneaky good end board, and so also technically can bring out the water statue, but from what I heard, they don't really go for that line, but I guess it's there. So you know what, something to watch out for. And then Super Heavy Samurai, how the mighty has fallen. I think at this point maybe this is more of an engine. I sort of commented on the meta tier list video how I at least saw like a spiral Super Heavy Samurai, for example. I think that's really cool. And so I also saw, personally played against something like just regular pendulum like Zephyra with Super Heavy Samurai stuff. So I think it's cool that at least is still kind of playable as an engine, but it is unfortunate that Konami just axed this deck right away, not allowing players to run a budget tier 1 deck for too long. Definitely kind of a surprise that they would hit a deck that fast. Hasn't happened, I don't think, in quite a while. But you know what, I guess one could argue having too many 1-card combos to bring out a very, very toxic board, maybe not good for the game either. But nonetheless, you know what, the engine at least is a deck, it's still there. And actually there was a regional top with Superheavy Samurai. I'm not entirely sure what variant it was, but certainly look forward to finding that out. And then we have Dogmatica, and so, you know, a while back I actually did a deck profile with it was like a going second Dogmatica build. It did get some new cards, I believe, in Photon Hypernova. It's very like kind of like anti-extra deck, I guess, like rips cards out of the extra deck, kind of like Hashir, but in a different fashion. In win percentage wise, it wasn't very high though, and so certainly this deck has come a long way since it used to be just more of an engine in terms of with Dogmatica Invoked, which was a very you know, strong tier 1 deck at the time. In a way, kind of hard to believe now because that was only a few years ago, but looking at it now, that deck, because I personally played it too, you know, it's not like oppressive or amazing rather, but you know what, at the time window was really, really strong. So next we have Plunder Patrol, which is an archetype that kind of has been phasing in and out in terms of rogue tier lists. Right now I think it's actually pretty cool because it already had a couple regional tops at least so far into this new format, and now with typically played with like adventure token stuff, which is actually good news I guess, because adventure token package is being reprinted in Battles of Legend. I do know that it is also played with like the runic package as well, and I think that's technically the more competitive variant, but you know what, that part is probably still a little bit expensive unfortunately for a rogue deck in terms of the runic package, but nonetheless I think this deck is really, really cool. They get some new support recently with like a new ship, and I think being able to like equip ships and, you know, having like whatever effects, I think it's a really cool strategy and certainly an interesting one. So next we have Dinomorphia, which I believe is another deck that got some recent support in Cyberstorm Access, and you know what, 50% win percentage is actually pretty impressive for this deck. In terms of regional level success, it actually already got 1 top so far, which I think is very cool. It's kind of an interesting strategy because of how much life point you're gonna lose throughout the course of the game, that I personally thought at a regional level event maybe it'll be a bit too risky to bring just because, you know, people might stall for time. But you know what, I guess we have technically 5 extra minutes now to play all of our matches, so perhaps that will come in clutch. But basically, you know, lots of trap heavy focus with a monster that kind of serves as almost like a Mystic Mind in a way. So you know what, something to consider if you're into control strategies. So next we have Eldlich, which sort of started to become popular again once the tier format ended, and also, you know, with Kashira, while it's still the best deck, you know, and that absolutely destroys Eldlich and Dimension Shifter is still legal. I guess technically, you know, with the ban list and Shifter got hit a little bit at least, you know, maybe some people are trying to explore with Eldlich a little bit more than usual. I certainly actually like Eldlich myself. I like it personally combined with the branded package, and so that's certainly, you know, for example, last year branded Eldlich was a tier 1 deck, and it's a deck that I played as well, and I recently did a deck profile on branded Eldlich for this current format too, so you can certainly check that out. But you know what, I really like the concept of Eldlich in terms of, you know, replacing your Golden Lord traps with like the other ones, and I think it's a very grindy one, and yes, skill drain is not fun, but at the same time it does have some pretty unique aspects to it as a control deck. And then we have Drytron, 54% match win percentage, really, really strong. Unfortunately, I think regional level success wise it hasn't had that much success essentially the last 2 formats now, even though, you know, it did get like Ben 10 to 3 for example, but again, you know, with Droll being so played, at least especially with Super Heavy when they were tier 1 for like 3 weeks, right now maybe it's a little bit there's a bit more breathing room, but again, similar to Dark World that I mentioned, you know, Droll is probably at least seeing some play in the side because of all the runic variants that's now come back in play, so you know what, Droll is kind of hard for Drytron, but otherwise, you know, it's a really fun combo wombo rogue ritual strategy. And then we have Exorcister, which is interesting because I really did not think I would see this again, especially now that tier limits were gone, because this was sort of considered as like that anti-tier deck. And you know what, 53% match win percentage among all players, really strong, although at the same time it's based on a lot smaller sample size, so keep that in mind. And this deck actually topped regionals, Toronto regionals in fact, which is an event that I was there, and it's funny because I didn't even know it until my friend in the States told me about it, that Exorcister top, which is too bad because I definitely would have loved to do a deck profile, and it was Steven, who's a really, really good player. He has like multiple YCS event tops, and I'm sure I'll see him at Niagara Regional this weekend, but nonetheless, you know what, it's interesting. It's kind of like another shifter based strategy. It can also play some floodgates, something like Gozu Match that are like all lights, and it has a lot of like banishing like effects. Unfortunately, you know, I guess if kaijus are popular, then it kind of folds that in a way, but I guess it does also have traps to kind of reset their things anyway. So but you know what, maybe it's a sneaky rogue contender for this format. So moving on to the final tier, we have Salamangreat, and so unfortunately 41% match win percentage among all players is not very good, and that new support coming around the corner is probably not going to do much to help with that. Unfortunately, no regional level event tops so far, and I don't think it had much last format either. It technically had some success a few formats ago, also in combination with the adventure token stuff, and now at least the adventure token package is being reprinted in Battles of Legend that's coming out soon, so maybe at least it becomes the competitive variant of it, maybe still becomes budget, because that's what this deck has always been known for, being a very budget friendly deck, even in its tier 1 days for the most part. And so while it's not nearly as successful right now, I'm sure Gazelle will come back to at least 2 soon. I'm not sure why it hasn't already when Engage came back to 2, so just, you know, sit tight. Hopefully it will come back to, at least in terms of better competitive relevancy, soon. And so we are finishing off with Dragonrider, which I'm almost a little surprised that got scored lower than Salamangreat somehow. No offense to the Salad players, but you know, it's especially in combination with Sprite, has always been pretty solid deck. Anytime I post a Dragonrider deck profile, it always does really well. So clearly a very well liked deck, and I'm sure someone will figure it out and get a regional top or 2 with Dragonrider, whether with Sprite or Pure or with the Lyrilisk stuff, for example. Even in its tier 1 days, it was always a pretty fair deck. I mean, Dragonrider Volt is pretty strong, but nothing too oppressive. And so, you know what, it's another solid deck option in terms of rogue decks. And so anyways, that's it for the rogue tier list for this month. Hopefully you found that interesting, and hopefully it was helpful in helping you choose that next rogue deck to pilot for this current format. So as usual, big thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my Patreons as always for supporting the channel, and well, take care guys.